All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Michael Scharf. I'm the co-dean of our law school, and it is my great pleasure to welcome everybody today to this lecture, Slavery and Human Trafficking in Supply Chains, by Dinda Thomas, who you'll be hearing more about in just a few minutes. I do want to start out by telling you that our law school has had a long history of initiatives to promote both civil rights and human rights. Many of you know that we were nominated a couple of years ago for the Nobel Peace Prize for our work to aid in the international prosecution of crimes against humanity, including massive sexual trafficking, forced prostitution, and sexual slavery. Human trafficking continues to be a growing problem that reaches every part of worldwide society and American society. In fact, it's the second largest criminal enterprise here in the United States behind drug trafficking. And you might find this statistic surprising, but this year, Ohio ranked fourth nationwide in the number of hotline calls associated with human trafficking. We opened our human trafficking law project in the fall of 2015 to address this growing and significant problem. This year, we were very happy to have received almost $1 million in grant money to continue to grow and expand our project under the able leadership of Maureen, and I'm just, I just did what I promised I wasn't going to do, Curtis, who used to be Maureen Kenny and is a wonderful colleague and long-serving professor here, but also a former colleague at Squire, back when it was Sanders, of our speaker. And so without further ado, I'm going to ask Maureen to come on up and introduce our speaker and kick things off. Again, welcome and enjoy the lecture.
Thanks so much, Michael. I'm so pleased to have you all here today. As our wonderful dean mentioned, we started our human trafficking law project in 2015, and we really have three primary missions. The first is to offer legal services to juvenile and adult human trafficking survivors. The second is to work on legislative reforms for victims of human trafficking, so working primarily on state legislation. And then the final mission is why we're here today, which is really to educate and raise awareness on this very important topic. We do a lot of programs like these. In March, we do our biggest program, which is our symposia on this topic. This year it was on March 3rd. We had our second annual Human Trafficking Symposium. It was attended by over 170 registrants. So look forward to that again next year. I encourage you to look for details for that on our website. But today we're focusing on a very important and often overlooked portion of human trafficking, which is labor trafficking. And I'm so honored to have Dinda Thomas with us today to share her expertise on this topic. Before I introduce her and give you a little bit of details about her expertise in this area, I just wanted to give you a little bit of details about how she'll do her presentation. Ms. Thomas is pleased to have questions during her presentation. You don't have to wait till the end. We just ask that because we are doing a webcast at the same time, I have the remote mic, so please just wait till I get to you so that even if she can hear you, the folks that are listening to the webcast can't hear you. So just wait till then. And then as you know, we only have an hour, so you may not be able to get your questions answered or we might not have enough time, but Ms. Thomas has ably agreed to stay after in the rotunda. We're not doing a formal reception, but she's agreed to stay after and answer questions and enter into any conversations that may come up as a result of her presentation. So Ms. Thomas focuses a significant portion of her practice at Squire Patton Boggs on conflict minerals, responsible sourcing, and supply chain transparency. She created and leads the firm's conflict mineral team and is the founder of the Conflict Mineral Law blog. She focuses on best practices across industries to provide efficient, effective counseling. This includes supply chain investigations and undertaking enterprise risk analysis around responsible sourcing issues. She was named by Corporate Responsibility magazine among its 2017 corporate responsibility superstars. She was also named as one of Ascent Compliance Top 100 Conflict Minerals Influence Leaders for 2016. And with that, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Dinda Thomas.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you for, I appreciate the invitation, and I'm really glad to be able to be here to talk with you today about this particular topic that I spend a lot of my time working on. And I think it's probably slightly different angle on an issue that many of you may be looking at. So it might be a little bit different, and I'm glad to kind of bring a different perspective, but one that will show you that what you do every day and what you use every day and what you consume every day could be part of this trafficking and supply chains issue. As Maureen indicated, the responsible sourcing and ethical sourcing is something that I spend a fair amount of my time working on with companies. I represent companies. So they're my clients. That's the perspective that I bring. And so I think that gives you another bit of insight into how this issue is addressed, what steps companies can take, what they're actually doing, which might surprise you, and where we go from here. First, I'll start with the context. Since the Magna Carta, we expect governments to protect people. They impose laws, enforce laws to protect people, especially the most vulnerable people. But governments don't always succeed in that. In fact, they fail a fair amount in that. In the mid-70s, governments, and especially those from the developed countries of Western Europe, US, Canada, Australia, et cetera, really started to impose expectations on multinational enterprises to take certain actions to protect human rights and to reduce human rights impacts of their commercial activities. And they've done this because of the intersection between commerce, creation of products, and production of services to human rights impacts and negative human rights impacts. That's what we'll be talking about today. We'll be really focusing on that and focusing on companies and what they can do. The recognition by governments and the pressure on governments for multinational enterprises to undertake these actions started with aspirational principles. Large statements aspiring for companies to take certain actions. They were not legal requirements. But what we see now, what's in force today, are a number of actual, real legal requirements. So soft law has become hard law, and we'll talk about that a bit too. When I talk today about this issue, I'll use terms like modern slavery, human trafficking, forced labor. We could spend a half an hour talking about the definitions, what those mean, what they don't mean, how they're different. I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I don't want to distract you from that. But in general, when I talk about modern slavery and human trafficking, forced labor, I'm talking about people who are providing a service or labor against their will or under a threat or after coercion or as a result of deception. That happens a lot. Sometimes there's a limitation on their freedom of movement, but that doesn't always occur. So that's how I'll use this term. The first slide here shows you just a representation of forced labor around the globe. This is a little bit dated. It comes from 2012, and the source is the ILO, the International Labor Organization. And you can read, when you get a copy of the slides, you can see the numbers. But the important thing is that this forced labor happens around the world. There's no region of the world that's immune from it. There have been cases against US companies for this occurring in the US, you might be surprised to know. You can also see by this slide that half of the forced labor occurs in Asia Pacific region. So there's a huge problem with Asia Pacific region, and we'll see, when you represent companies, you say, I know a lot of production facilities, I know there are a lot of facilities located in Asia Pacific, so that might be an issue that companies need to address if they're operating there. There's a group called Walk Free, which is a non-governmental organization that works on this issue. They estimate global forced labor at 35 million. So the number's huge, whether it's the 21 that's here or 35 million. This is a significant issue. You can also see this comes from a Department of Labor report, which is products, list of goods produced from forced labor. If you look at this list, you'll see how many goods and products are produced by forced labor around the globe. Many of these, there's some similarities if you look at this listing. They're products that come from agriculture, aquaculture, and mining. So these are the extractives, the raw materials, the raw natural resources areas of focus. There's a lot of forced labor and modern slavery in those industries. Also, textiles and footwear may not surprise you. That's the lot of history about sweatshops and concern about conditions of people who work in textiles, garment factories, and footwear. There's also a lot of concern about electronics. So if you have a cell phone, and I'll bet everybody in here does, if you have a computer, an iPod, an iPad, those are, there's a lot of concern about the role in forced labor in the production of electronics. So you'll see that listed as well. The boards that we have down here in front just sort of emphasize the fact that everywhere around us are products that are produced in some cases by forced labor, and it indicates the reason why there's so much interest and animation about this issue with non-governmental organizations, activists, companies, etc., is that so much of what consumers buy and use is under risk of being produced by forced labor. So we know that there are several risk factors that increase the incidence of human trafficking and forced labor in a supply chain. One of those factors is an industry. Certain types of industries have higher incidences of forced labor than others. And some of the ones that are of the highest risk are listed here. You can see the correlation between these industries and the products that we just looked at. Agriculture, electronics, mining, fishing, forestry, etc. You can see here also hospitality is a high risk for slave labor and forced labor. And another one that's listed here that we didn't talk about already is construction. So there are many infrastructure and construction projects around the world that are at great risk for slavery and human trafficking because of the number of low-skilled workers and the number of migrant workers that are used in these projects. Is there a question? Oh, I am sorry. The question was about the acronym at the top of the slide. SHT is my shorthand for slavery and human trafficking. So, apologies, I should have clarified that. So these are industries that are at higher risk for slavery and human trafficking. There's also a geographic element. Regions that have low protections of rights of workers are at higher risk. Countries with a higher tolerance of corruption. So if you see incidences of corruption and bribery in certain countries, you can bet there's almost a 100% correlation between that and the incidence of slavery and human trafficking. Low economic development, so the preponderance of lower skilled workers is a risk factor. Trade zones that are export oriented and therefore price and quality sensitive are at higher risk, and also countries that have very particular guest worker visa programs, like places in the Middle East, and even U.S. Agricultural workers are also subject to a higher risk of slavery and human trafficking. The final area that we look at to try to determine where there may be a higher risk of human rights impacts is in the area of business models. So the use of lower skilled workers or dangerous work, higher risk of forced labor, because those jobs are not as attractive, and it takes some effort to get workers in those areas. Also seasonal work that can't be anticipated, work that spikes. So you can think of agriculture, but also please remember that companies, say electronics companies that are working to fulfill holiday orders, those are of higher risk for forced labor conditions. Also, the biggest risk, what I would call maybe the biggest risk for companies and global companies is the use of labor brokers and labor recruiters. These are third parties who come in and say to large US companies, say operating in Malaysia, we will take care of the finding your workers, paying your workers, we'll have a contract with you and we'll take care of all that for you. It's an attractive option. It makes sense for companies that don't know the rules, regulations, don't know how to find workers in another country. But the risk there is that there's a break in the chain between the employer and the employees, and those third-party brokers and labor recruiters can undertake practices that the corporation would never undertake themselves. So that's a higher risk, and when companies work with labor recruiters and brokers, they really need to work closely with them to make sure that the practices are appropriate. And we talked already about when you have a migrant workforce, higher migrants, especially foreign migrants, people who don't speak the local language, those are at higher risk of forced labor as well. Another thing that you see in these areas where you have lower skilled workers, migrants from other countries, is that employers often take possession of their identity papers or their travel papers. And when that happens, there is a much higher risk of limiting the ability of that person to move, to travel, to leave, and to seek other employment. And that's something that is used fairly often and causes a great deal of problem. So what does this look like in certain types of industries? This is a picture of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It happens to be by a mining operation, but you can see this looks like coercion to me. This looks like threat to me. It also occurs in textiles. This is a picture, I think it's either Bangladesh or India, I can't remember which, and it shows a very young worker working without safety equipment. It's this kind of thing that occurs throughout textiles and garments and footwear industry. Agriculture is another one we talked about. This particular picture is of workers in Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is one of the world's largest producers of cotton, but when the cotton crop is ready to be harvested, the government requires workers to leave what they're doing, and they take professionals, teachers, medical people, lawyers, teachers, professors, and force them to go into the fields to pick the crop. And that's required by government. So that's coerced by the government with threats as well. And another picture then, and stories that you'll hear often, some of the most horrendous stories that you've seen with New York Times articles, Guardian, YouTube videos, other investigative reports, has to do with aquaculture in Southeast Asia. So people are taken, put onto boats, and those boats may not go to shore for years at a time, literally years at a time. These are sometimes the sources of the shrimp that you might buy at I won't name a name of a store. I don't want to cast aspersions, but next time you go to a supermarket, look on the back as the country of origin of the shrimp, frozen shrimp in your grocery store. If somewhere in Southeast Asia, it's a fairly high risk of that it's a product of forced labor. So that's the context, that's the issue, and that's the problem, and that's the prevalence of the problem. So we say, how does that impact corporations? Well, back in the middle 70s, governments, and this is the developed countries of Western Europe, Canada, US, got together and said, we're going to make recommendations, the governments, recommendations to multinational corporations. What can they do? What should they do? What do we expect them to do to reduce the risk of slavery and human trafficking and forced labor and other human rights violations? So again, it's important. That's a government statement to multinational corporations. And then in the year 2000, we have launched another aspirational set of principles, the UN Global Compact. And that was a process where CEOs of corporations signed on to an agreement saying this is the way we expect to operate our businesses. You also have, we continue to develop here in 2011, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights was adopted. And it has 3 elements that it focuses on. One is what governments are required to do. Another one is what remedies need to be provided to people who are victims of slavery and human trafficking and human rights violations. And the third one, really importantly, is what are companies responsible for doing? What should companies be doing? So again, we see a constant growing crescendo of expectations on multinational corporations for responsible business conduct throughout the globe. And then the final reference is Sustainable Development Goals. It's another set of goals and ambitions for companies to adhere to in how they operate their businesses. So that's a set of aspirational goals. Sometimes they're very aspirational and very difficult to meet, high bar, but they are expectations on multinational corporations. But because they were aspirational, not every company adhered to them or adhered to them fully. They weren't as widely accepted as governments hoped they would be. And so they started to create actual affirmative legal obligations. And the ones listed on this page fit into that category. These are actual, real obligations on companies to do certain things, to take certain actions. And we'll talk a bit more about those in a little bit. So again, we want to talk about what are some of the challenges that corporations have in meeting these obligations. One thing to recognize is that when companies are taking action and are disclosing and talking about what they're doing, stakeholders, various parties, read that information, see that information, take that information in. And some of them want companies to move faster, further, and do more. And so they may seek to require companies to take further actions. They may use social media campaigns to push companies to do more. And there are real threats of litigation. There have been litigation cases brought against corporations for their commercial activities using slavery, forced labor, human trafficking as the basis for those claims. And disclosure, which is the basis of some of those regulations that we'll talk about in a minute. Disclosure does have consequences. The disclosure obligations that are in place and that companies are responsible to comply with are based on an idea of name and shame. And that's what's up there in quotes. The idea is that if a company has to make certain disclosure about what it's doing, and that disclosure is not up to snuff, it's not what companies think it should be, or it's not what their stakeholders think it should be, then they will try harder to do better. And so by being ashamed, they will do better and increase their activities and their efforts in a particular area. The NGOs, excuse me, non-governmental organizations and activists spend a lot of time working in a variety of areas that are connected with human rights issues. It may be concerns with taking of lands in various countries, may be slavery and human trafficking, it may be deforestation, environment, et cetera. Those NGOs and activists have also spent some time gathering up and reviewing all the disclosures that corporations make, and then they will do reporting and scoring of them, and then publish those results. So they'll call companies out specifically by indicating that XYZ company has ranked very low and is not doing enough in this area. The hope there is that consumers, their customers, their shareholders, other activists will come together and put pressure on that company to do more. Those NGO reports do label certain industries and certain companies as laggards, and others, they really put a lot of pressure on them to do more. NGOs also, in their own way, have almost become like a regulator, because they spend a lot of time and effort and money publishing reports and talking with companies and telling companies what they expect. And they say it in a way that almost sounds like this is a legal obligation, but it's really an NGO saying this is what we expect. And because of the power of social media, YouTube, social media campaigns, et cetera, those expectations of NGOs almost do become like a regulation. And the final impact and difficulty, the risk of disclosure, is that plaintiffs will use that disclosure against the companies if they sue them or have some other kind of lawsuit against them for a perceived lack of effort or a perceived lack of efficiency of programs. So another challenge that companies have in dealing with these requirements is that they take time and resources. And unlike what many people believe, corporations don't have endless resources, and they typically, the people within companies who are responsible for these programs, for implementing them and developing them, they don't hire all new people for those to undertake that work. And so the people within companies that are doing that work are hard pressed. There's just not a lot of additional resources to deal with. So we'll talk some about what companies are actually doing and what steps they're taking. And they do take time, they do take money, and so that's something that I think is not as well appreciated by people outside of companies, that these things do take a lot of time and energy. Some of the things that companies do to address these issues are listed here, and we'll talk about some of them in more detail a little bit later. Another challenge that companies face is that these responsible sourcing and ethical sourcing requirements tell a company that they're responsible for sourcing and chain of custody of their products from where they are in the supply chain all the way to the beginning. So an automobile maker is responsible for where the iron was sourced. It's responsible for the electronics, for the tin that's in that electronical device, where it was mined, and the conditions of every step along the way. So this is just an illustration of the number of indirect suppliers that most manufacturers have to deal with, and have to get a good sense of what those indirect suppliers are doing. And companies are being held accountable for what those indirect suppliers are doing. So it's a very complicated process, it's a time-consuming process, and it's difficult. The other thing that this illustrates is that when companies are making disclosures about what's happening in that entire supply chain, of course they have to rely on information provided by all of those indirect suppliers. So the information that a company provides is only as good as the information that came from those tier 5 suppliers. So companies are at risk of making disclosures that they worry and they wonder about how good those disclosures are because they just don't have visibility into those operations. So they do the best they can. They create procedures and processes to enhance the quality of the information they're obtaining, but that's just one of those natural consequences of the system.
Can I ask a question about that, Dinda? So because I know under some of the government regulations, that's required. It's not just aspirational, it's required.
Yep.
So how do they do that? Like, is that part of the bidding process when they're bidding to subcontractors that you submit all of that information? And I guess my question, I assume that it is. And then my question is, what if they get misinformation? Can they just then say, well, I got misinformation and therefore it's the subcontractor's fault?
Yeah, for what you're referring to at least includes government contracts work. So there's an obligation for a company that signs a contract with the U.S. government. If it reaches certain criteria, they have to tell the government that they have a procedure and a process in place to address slavery and human trafficking. And then they have to certify that there's no slavery and human trafficking in their supply chain, period. That's what they have to certify. They have to certify that to get the contract. They have to certify it annually. Those provisions are typically in the contracts that entity signs with the other contractors that it works with. So it imposes those obligations on those contractors as part of a contractual arrangement. And they'll work with those contractors to make sure that they get training, that they're aware of the requirements, so that they have the tools at hand to try to help create the conditions so that those statements are correct. But if they're wrong, and if there has been slavery and human trafficking in their supply chain, they will be held accountable for it. Now, that's when the company is well served to have a lot of records, internal records about steps they took, what they did to accomplish these relationships with their subcontractors and suppliers, what they did to try to train people, all those steps that they took to try to create the conditions under which those statements would be true. But the risk is that those contracts can be terminated, and the risk also is that those contractors could be debarred, which means they would be no longer eligible for doing any government contract work. And that's an incredibly huge penalty that companies will work very hard to avoid, because it's a very significant part of business for many companies. But that is an expression of some of the problems that companies have and why it's so difficult. And I referred to this. I won't go into too much detail, even though we're sitting here at a law school and you could spend probably a whole week worth of coursework or longer on specific cases. But there have been cases filed in the U.S. In various states. Most of them have been in California, but not only in California, where either victims of forced labor or consumers of products produced by what is allegedly forced labor have brought a suit against corporations. And they're in the process. Some of them have been dismissed. They're being appealed. These haven't been decided. And interestingly, something we'll be watching, and you may be watching as well, is that the U.S. Supreme Court is going to be looking at a case to decide if non-U.S. persons can sue a U.S. related corporation for events that took place outside of the U.S. under the Alien Tort Claims Act. And that case is going to be decided. It'll be argued here pretty soon. So keep an eye on that. That will be very significant because these were cases where um, human rights impacts were felt in countries in Africa. People in Africa were trying to sue that corporation, even though all of the events occurred in Africa. They were trying to access U.S. courts to litigate those issues. So we'll see what happens as a result of those cases. Yes, there's another question.
So I think it was a little over a year ago, Apple had a very public disclosure of, I think, their factories in China. They're using either forced labor or the working conditions were quite horrendous. Um, as far as that, do you know what the repercussions were? Because I don't think Apple suffered any real consequences. Their market value is the highest it's ever been. Like people aren't not buying iPhones because they're using forced labor. So for big companies like Apple, let's say Nike, even like companies like Tesla and things like that, they're
Mhm.
like, what's the incentive for them um, to kind of filter out and make sure their supply chains don't have this type of behavior when it doesn't help or it doesn't hurt them financially.
Well, that's a great question. Um, Several of the companies you named are actually viewed as leaders in this area, including Apple, HP, um, uh, Intel. Obviously, is another one. They have done a lot. There certainly are instances of forced labor that are still in their supply chains, but they have made a lot of progress. I think it remains to be seen. I think part of companies that are um, subject to most pressure and negative um, social media campaigns are those that start out not being viewed as favorably. So Apple is a big favorite of millennials and people who use technology, um, and so they have a very favorable. They're viewed favorably, but it is entirely possible that people could band together and say we're going to mount a campaign against Apple or to pressure Apple to do more, or to make sure that these particular suppliers are removed from their supply chain. I don't know the facts of that case, but I expect that um, Apple probably did address those particular suppliers, and maybe not immediately, depending on what the contracts were or contract terms were, but they probably did address those, and that may be why we haven't heard anything more about those. Um, there are companies that, and you can go, if you go into Apple's website, you can read their California Transparency and Supply Chains Act disclosure, and they will tell you what they do as a corporation in this area. You can probably also look at their sustainability report, and that would tell you the same thing. And you can see some of the steps they've taken, and they may even talk about this issue and how they resolved it. But that's exactly the situation that NGOs are hoping for, that all this information that's out there, the reports come out, and that they create as um, a setting for companies to take action to address them, or they will face the ire of consumers and others. So that's exactly what we talk about.
Are really in America or anywhere else willing to pay less or pay more for products?
Yeah, the question is, are the rules and regulations impose on corporations an obligation that ultimately will result in higher prices, higher costs? I think there have been a lot of studies about about consumers, what they want, what they'll pay for. There's a lot of inconsistent information out there. So if you're looking at textiles and garments, everybody wants to pay the lowest price and get fast fashion. The whole idea is that's the term, fast fashion. And you don't get fast fashion by paying more to lower skilled workers. Um, so those are under high demand. There's a lot of pressure on bricks and mortar stores to stay open. And then you've got garment, textile retailers are under a lot of pressure to do more, to take more action to make sure that their products are not produced in a way that has negative human rights impacts. I think what a lot of the studies will show is that millennials are more in tune with this issue, more likely to say they would be willing to pay more, maybe not a lot more, but more if they knew the sourcing of the products. Walmart has started a program where it's going to be able, at some point, it wants to be able to tell you the whole line, the whole supply chain of each product that's in its store. There'll be a QR code on the product, and you'll be able to access that and see the human rights impacts of those products. So they're banking on the fact that people are going to be willing to pay for the extra cost that's embedded in that. I think what we're seeing more and more, depending on the industry, certain industries are better at certain of these human rights issues than others. So electronics has been really, really good about conflict minerals, source, chain of custody of all these metals in their products. They've, in general, not been as good with the slavery and human trafficking issue. Textiles, footwear has been very good comparatively on slavery, human trafficking, forced labor conditions. They've been very good about it because they've had some very serious disasters that they've dealt with for the last 20 years. That has meant that overall the industry has spent a lot of time and effort on that. So they really have improved it a lot. Other industries have not done that much in that area, and so they're not as far along. So there's a lot of dissimilarity between different industries and different issues and who's performing well and who's been successful. I think if we talk to people, a lot of it I really think depends upon age and socioeconomic status as to what people are willing to pay for. That's my own view. All right, so we'll get quickly into the actual prescriptive regulations that deal with slavery and human trafficking. First is a California regulation. Second is a UK act. Both of those deal with disclosure. Those are disclosure only. Nothing specific is required, just disclosure. And then the Federal Acquisition Regulation is what Maureen mentioned a little bit ago, and the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, we'll talk about those as well. Those are actual prescriptive regulations. So the California regulation applies to companies that do business in California. If they have global receipts of 100 million in a year, and they're identified as manufacturers or retailers when they file their tax returns in California, they will be subject to this rule. What's required by the California regulation is disclosure about what companies have done to eradicate slavery and human trafficking in their direct product supply chains. So it deals with products, it deals with what companies have done to address this issue. It is possible to comply with this regulation if you disclose that you've done nothing, basically. So the rule just requires disclosure, and then it leaves to consumers, activists, NGOs, and others to impose any further obligation on companies by putting pressure on them. There are specific topics that are required to be provided in the statement for the California Act, and I'd suggest you could go to almost any retailer, retail company, clothing maker, and they will have a California Transparency in Supply Chains Act disclosure, and you can take a look at what those look like. The UK Modern Slavery Act was enacted very shortly after the California Act and is based on the California Act. So it also focuses on disclosure. It's much broader, though, because it covers companies that produce goods and products. So it covers not only manufacturers, but it covers law firms, insurance companies, banks. It covers a huge swath. Those companies are also required to post these reports on their webpage, which is the same as what's done in California. and you're required to have these statements approved by the board of directors and signed by a director, which is a higher bar. It gets a lot of attention by companies in the UK. This one is much broader, though, than the California Act because it covers, like I said, not only goods and services. It also covers companies' own operations and their entire supply chain. So the California Act requires companies ask questions and gather information about their direct suppliers, while the UK regulation requires they gather information about not only their own operations, but their entire supply chain, top to bottom. So it's a much broader regulation.
Required of law firms?
What is covered in really all of these is a description of the business, what the business is, and and by that, what your risk is that you'll have forced labor, human trafficking in your supply chain. What kind of business you undertake, what you do, if you're in construction or if you're in a law firm. You also describe what your policies are, what training or awareness you give to your employees about the issue, any steps you've taken to identify instances of slavery and human trafficking in your own supply chain. Admittedly, law firms is not a great source of place where they're going to find incidences of that. But if you look at, say, hospitality, domestic workers that are invisible or unseen, there may be more instances there. So it is intended to be very, very broad, intended to cover a wide swath and not give any particular industry a pass on this. I think they also did it to try to level the playing field and make sure that certain industries are not paying a higher cost of compliance than others. The Federal Acquisition Regulation is what Maureen mentioned early on. This is a regulation that applies to government contractors. And it was recently amended in 2015 to require companies to state and certify, or to assure that there's no slavery and human trafficking in their operations and supply chains. And that covers their own employees, that covers their agents, that covers their subcontractors. Also, if you're a company that has larger contracts with the U.S. government, so they're a value of $500,000 or more, and they're performed outside of the U.S., those companies have to certify that they have programs in place to identify these issues and assess and address them, and also certify that there's no human trafficking or slavery in their supply chains. So this is a very significant one for the reasons we talked about a little bit earlier. The Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act is one that's important because it was enacted in 2015. It made an amendment to a 1930s law that prohibited products from slave labor to be imported into the U.S. But in that 1930s law, there was an exception for goods the demand for which couldn't be met by U.S. manufacturers. Pretty significant exception. And this act eliminated that exception. So now it is absolutely prohibited to import products that are product of slave labor into the U.S. There are various penalties for this. The one that is the most interesting really is that if there is information that a product is coming in through customs, then it's a product of slave labor, it can be halted there and not allowed entry. There have been products that have been being imported from China that have been stopped. And if you go to the customs customs website, you'll see the description of the instances where that has occurred. So now we get to, with all that background, what are companies supposed to do? What can companies do? What should they be doing? There are You could spend 100% of a working day reading daily updates, new white papers, articles, um, frameworks, suggestions, toolkits, ideas that come from all over the place, from NGOs, from governments, trying to tell companies what to do. And I think the biggest hurdle that companies face is, there's so much information, it's coming from all over the place. What am I supposed to do? How do I address this? One good resource to use is OECD guidance. The OECD is the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation and Development. It's basically the developed nations in Europe, US, Canada, those nations, and that group has developed several sets of guidance for companies to use and these guidances are addressed to certain industries. I happened to pull out the most recent one, which is dealing with responsible supply chains and garment and footwear sector. And this guidance goes through and explains to companies what are the areas that they should focus on, what should they be looking at. I like to use this as a starting point for a framework because the OECD guidance is very well accepted. It's been developed in a bunch of different industries, and it's pretty well regarded. It's very robust, and I think companies would find it very difficult to do everything that's listed here, and that's not what I would recommend. But it gives a good, solid framework that's fairly consistent from one industry to another. Yes? There's a question.
Thank you. I think you might have touched on this a little bit earlier, but at what point does this become a loophole for companies to get out of? Sort of this, I was reading an article maybe 2 years ago, and it was dealing with a certain component that's used in smartphones, and it was coming from the Congo, and under the Obama administration, they had passed legislation to try to address this issue, but it seemed like companies were still getting out of it because they were saying that, well, we don't know for sure what's going on ground. And so, if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I think I don't know specifically the instance you're talking about, but it sounds like it dealt with conflict minerals. So certain minerals have been a focus of the conflict minerals rule in the U.S. Again, that rule didn't limit or ban any substances from anywhere. It was geared towards directing companies to learn more about the sourcing of these minerals and metals in certain of their products, and to encourage them, because they have to disclose what they find out, to discourage them to do more to make sure that these metals and minerals come from conflict-free sources. So you can continue to bring things in from these countries, you can continue to bring in tin from the Congo, but the goal is to get them from sources that are certified as conflict-free. So they're good sourcing of metals from those industries. I think that one of the problems with conflict minerals and what stories that you hear in the media is that the headlines are just wrong. The headlines make you think that there are certain materials that are banned and that companies are getting away with it. But it's not what the regulation required. And what companies have been saying is, hey, we've been working at this for 4 or 5 years. We're trying to gather information about sourcing and chain of custody of these materials, but we still don't have perfect information. We continue to work on it, but we don't have perfect information yet. And so that's probably what you were hearing, is that companies, they still don't know for sure about the source and chain of custody, but they're continuing to work towards gathering information. And it's an imperfect system. And I know from working with clients of my own, they've been working at this for 4 or 5 years and still don't have that detailed information, especially about the sourcing that comes from that close to the mine or the project. And especially when minerals and metals from that region and in those types of metals can be mined by artisanal miners. So this is individual families who are taking these minerals to the broker houses. So it's very difficult to trace and track certain minerals. Yes?
Do you find it dangerous when you ask an industry to do its own investigation? I feel like it's kind of asking the tobacco company to research lung cancer.
Well, I think certain industries have been really good at creating processes and procedures to be followed, and then getting industry acceptance of those processes and procedures, so that most all companies in that industry are taking the same actions, and they're getting the benefit of that being more economical, being more efficient, gathering the same information, being able to trace and track to certain locations and certain, say, smelters and refiners. Um, I think possibly that's part of what the disclosure is intended to get to, and that is that companies will disclose certain things, and it'll be up to outside people to assess how the quality of those disclosures, or whether they think those disclosures are adequate, or if they say enough. And then the markets will come and consumers will come and put pressure on companies to do more. I think the disclosures that are being made here really aren't investigations as much as they're gathering information about certain parts of the supply chain. And so you could argue about the quality of those and the efficiency and effectiveness of that. But I think it has been very effective in certain industries, when industries can get together and come up with tools that are good, consistent, and where there's an industry standard. And we can argue and talk about whether that's effective, or whether there's another method that would be more effective to get to that goal.
This is the last question, and then we're going to let Ms. Thomas sum up.
Okay.
I'm not sure how to ask it. What do the studies say about whether this sort of regulation or these sort of requirements are effective, do what they purport to do, are cost effective? I guess that would be part one, and part two would be, what do the studies say, or what can you say about the downside or deleterious effects of this kind of stuff, other than increased cost? I am thinking in particular of what you just mentioned about the artisanal family who mine stuff, and you know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Are they?
Yep. There have been there are a lot of studies and a lot of work by academics and NGOs and other activists to try to answer those questions. Is this helping? Are there negative, unforeseen negative consequences? And I think there is argument on both sides of that issue. The conflict minerals issue, there's testimony in front of the House Financial Services Committee on both sides of that, coming down on both sides. There are lots of articles about the unforeseen consequences, unintended consequences of these on artisanal miners, and the price of metals, and the ability of individual families to continue mining and to be successful and be able to feed their families by doing this. So there isn't agreement. I think that there's evidence that it has been helpful in many places, but there also have been unintended consequences. And that's really true, certainly in the conflict minerals and the mining side. Now, on the slavery and human trafficking, I think the question really is probably in that instance, it's cost. Is this a cost that you're willing to bear? You being the company, you being the consumer, and what are the consequences of eliminating slavery and human trafficking, forced labor, in addition to cost? And that's the key thing: is what are those other consequences, and how can you reduce those other consequences while still accomplishing the eradication of slavery and human trafficking, and getting to a point where you can isolate it to cost, and then accomplish those things in a more efficient, effective way. And that's why I think the best approach, I think what's most important is for industries to come up with uniform approaches, toolkits, templates to be able to accomplish the gathering of information and actually the putting pressure on suppliers in a way that's effective. When there's 1,000 different requirements and white papers and templates coming from all these different sources, it doesn't help create a single framework that's going to be able to be adapted by a lot of different corporations. And I think that's the real key. And that's why the conflict minerals industry application of the conflict minerals process has been so successful, is that there's really one industry standard throughout the world for gathering this information. And that's made it a lot more efficient and effective. And getting to that point in these other issues will be the key. We've lost the feed, it looks like. I don't know if we, well, there's a lot more information in the slides about what companies are actually doing, what they can do, what they should do, and also what they are doing. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what companies are really doing. You can go on a company's website and look for this information, and you might be surprised about the steps that companies really are taking. Companies that I've worked with are taking action to make sure that there's one of the most common things you see is that employees are paying a fee to get a job. It's very common. There are a lot of companies who have adopted what's called the employer pays principle. And that means that throughout their organization, if they find instances where an employee has had to pay a fee to get a job, which is very common, then they pay that fee back. They do not allow it. They prohibit their labor contractors from doing it, and they actually pay it back. They make sure that workers have a safe place to put their travel documents and papers that they have access to, so they have control over those things and not the employer. Those are the kinds of things that companies are doing, actions they're taking, and steps they're taking to improve situations on the ground, to put more pressure on their suppliers and their agents to undertake better processes and to have better policies in place, and to be more aware and to give training and awareness to their own employees, to their suppliers and contractors more broadly, so that the issue can be identified and addressed if and when it does arise. And I'd be glad to talk with anybody outside the room, address questions as long as you have them. I love talking about these kinds of things, and I think that there is a great opportunity for companies to participate in solving some really important issues as long as we address it in the right way. Thank you so much.